Hi, Jake from Wellness in Motion and Linfield here with our second video in this series here titled How Tight Hamstrings Can Ruin Your Bum. So if you feel that you have tight hamstrings, this knowledge is going to be no doubt useful to you. First up, let's take a look at specifically what the hamstrings are. So the hamstrings, if you're unsure about this, are the rear aspect of your thigh, and what they do in the body is that they extend the hip joint. That means that the knee is moving back relative to the hip, such as it does when you're walking upstairs. They flex the knee joint as well, which means that your heel is coming closer to your bum whilst the knee is bending, right? And they're involved in bending forward. This is a different example of how they work. The previous examples was a concentric contraction. They also work eccentrically, which means that they lengthen to allow the action to occur. So as the back of the leg lengthens here, the pelvis itself can rotate forward, which allows this lady here to bend further forward and get into that fully folded position, which most people can't get into, right? So they're also involved in walking upstairs, squatting, lunging, running. Basically anything involving the hip joint potentially involves the hamstrings, okay? So you might be wondering, how can tight hamstrings ruin your bum? Well, first of all, let's acknowledge that for a lot of people, they're sitting down a large percentage of the day. Certainly all of us grew up in schooling and education seated down, and many of us move into jobs where we're also sitting down. So it's also the case that many people don't stretch at all. So this is how the hamstrings become tight. If you look at the lady here with the seated position, and here's our femur here, that's the bone that runs down the thigh, and here's our hamstrings on the underside of the leg. You'll see that the knee is flexed here, the feet are underneath. Sometimes if you're in a so-called healthy seated position, the foot comes straight down, but that's certainly distant to the leg coming out straight as it does when you're standing up, for example. So most of the time if you're seated, the leg's at least 90 degrees, isn't it? Which means that the hamstrings are at about half their natural resting length, right? They're in a shortened position, so that's how they become tight. Now, as they become tight, because your legs are tucked under the chair for a majority of the day, for many, it actually also rotates the pelvis backward because the tension of the hamstring is actually pulling on the underside of the pelvis. Now, this also causes a subsequent postural issue where you tend to slouch or drop your chest further. That's called kyphosis. Because your bum's tucking under, it results in you kind of folding more into the position. Now, the issue with this is that when you go to lift something, for example, here's our lady on the side here doing a deadlift. When you go to lift something heavy, because of that posterior pelvic rotation, because the hamstrings are too tight, then you get here a loading in the low back or the lumbar extensors and tissue around the low back. Now this is actually going to cause an inhibition of the neurological pathways that go from the low back and to the glutes to cause the glutes to fire, right? So here's our L4 and L5 nerves coming out of that area and going down. Here's the superior gluteal nerve and inferior gluteal nerve that innervates your glutes. Right? So in other words, the electricity coming from your nervous system needs to reach the muscles called your glutes if you want them to fire. So this interferes in them firing, so that if you undertake a strengthening exercise, for example this glute bridge position, then instead of the glutes doing the job because they're not firing properly, the hamstrings, they have to take the load, right? So if your glutes aren't firing, then they're not activating either, which means that the muscle can't develop. So you won't develop this beautiful gluteal shape that is indicative of a functional glute, right? This pear or hourglass shape, because the glutes are activating, they're firing, and they, what's called hypertrophy. They grow larger or they grow more toned as a result of that activity. So what instead, in its place, you'll get typically is a flat gluteal shape and actually a dysfunctional bum that doesn't work properly. It can cause issues with the function and movement of your pelvis. Of course, it's associated with back pain. It can also be the cause of knee and ankle pain, because the whole kinetic chain, as it were, needs to fire correctly if you want things to operate well in your body. So also, another thing is that when you're walking or running around, general activity involving the hip joint, or even going upstairs, squatting, bending, just doing normal movements that you would do to try and target the glutes, what you'll find is that if the hamstrings are tight, now they're going to take the load first. It's like a rubber band. If you've got a short rubber band, it becomes tight first and zings straight back, doesn't it? If it's longer, it takes a lot more range of motion before it gathers tension and has that zing in it. So subsequently, your hamstrings take that load when you're walking up the stairs, lunging, bending, etc. And your glutes, they miss out, because the glutes actually extend the hip joint as well. If your hamstrings extend the hip joint, it's like they say, sorry, we've already done the job. Your glutes say, oh, okay, righto, we'll just stay out of it then, right? Now, if you can imagine your glutes are staying out of it, they're not going to develop size, shape, tone, etc. So that's going to result again in that flat bum position, because the glutes are not being stimulated. So I hope those ideas have been useful to you and got you thinking a little. It's something that we go into in our Better Booty training program that we undertake here at Wellness in Motion in Linfield. If you'd like to know more about the information that I'm talking about, this is actually part of a broader series to educate people in relation to the function of the glutes, developing a healthy functional booty, as it were. And if you're not already on our e-list, then go ahead and head over to wellnessinmotion.com.au, put your email in there, and we'll be sending out these videos as they are created. All right, hope you've enjoyed that. I'll look forward to creating more content and being in touch soon.